Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Diana Darke. Diana has worked and lived in the Middle East and Syria for 30 years. She studied Arabic at Oxford University and Islamic art and archaeology at SOAS. She owns and has restored a house in Damascus, which is the topic of her book, My House in Damascus. She has also recently published a socioeconomic history of the country called The Merchant of Syria. Last year, as France argued about the restoration of its national treasure, the fire-struck Notre Dame, Diana wrote her book, Stealing from the Saracens. The book puts forward the argument that some of the most recognizable forms of European architecture, including those of Notre Dame, actually originated in the Islamic Middle East. The book, when it was published in August 2020, attracted so much attention in the architectural press that the entire run was sold out on publication day. So please join me in welcoming Diana Darke. Please post your questions in the question box and they will be aired. Diana, do start your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Tanvir, and thank you for this opportunity to speak at the Lahore Literary Festival. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you on a visual journey through showing you quite a few slides to tell the story, really, because pictures do speak louder than words in this case. And so the place to start really is with the title, Stealing from the Saracens. It's caused an awful lot of controversy because people have taken it literally, stealing from the Saracens. But what I explain in the introduction is that this is a very deliberate choice. It's a double irony because the derivation of the word Saracens, which is how Europeans designated all Arab Muslims in the Middle Ages, is from the Arabic saraka, to steal. So Saracens is people who steal and loot. So the irony is that we Europeans called people, we called them looters when we actually took things from them. It's meant to be slightly funny. It's not meant to be taken seriously. And the reason that we've even used the word Saracens at all, which is obviously a slightly archaic word in the title, again, is very deliberate. It's because Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, said late in life in his memoirs that he believed that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. So he, based on a lifetime of observations, and he lived to be 90, and he was a very, very widely read man who was very interested in many influences from all over the world. So it wasn't a conclusion he arrived at lightly. So this is just to give you the backdrop of the title so that you understand the context of the book, really. It's all about Christopher Wren, which is why the book itself starts with Christopher Wren. And just to point out that at the bottom there, under the photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, is a discount code of Saracens 25, which you can use if you want to order the book directly from Hurst Publishers, and they will post it out to you wherever you are in the world. The postage is calculated and just added on exactly as it is, nothing added. So the reason I even wrote this book is because of the fire at Notre Dame. Obviously came out of the blue, and suddenly the world was in mourning, and the French nation, there was this huge outpouring of grief, this great symbol of European and French identity going up in flames. And to be honest, it slightly startled me. And I thought, wait a minute, don't people realize that this building, it's not as European as everybody seems to think? Most of the features in its architecture are actually derived from Middle East and from Islamic features. So I put out a very simple tweet on the morning after the fire, just saying that and attaching a couple of photos to prove my point. And I was staggered at the response. I mean, it just went completely viral, and clearly nobody actually knew about this. The theory of Christopher Wren from way back in the late 17th century It had got completely airbrushed out of history, basically, and swept under the carpet. So the fact that I was mentioning it again seemed to come as a huge surprise. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of a decapitated saint. Now, this saint, he is actually on the front, the western portal of Notre Dame, and he is Saint Denis. And this is one of the extraordinary things I started to uncover in the researches of the book, because it's a real story of misinterpretation and ignorance that in the Middle Ages, we have to remember, there was no internet, you know, people didn't know very much. Only a small number of people were literate. And so there was a huge amount of misunderstanding and muddled identities. I call them medieval muddles. And Denis is a case in point. So Denis turns out to be 3 different Denises, all conflated. So there's the one that the French like to think of, who is their patron saint, Saint Denis, who was martyred by Roman soldiers, you know, killed for his belief, and then picked up his own head and walked, you know, longer. So this was the great miracle. That's why he's shown in this decapitated form. But then there are 2 other Denises, and the significant one is the one who was pretending to be a disciple of St. Paul and called himself Dionysius, which is the same as Denis, and wrote a very influential text called Celestial Hierarchies. And this was very, very influential in the Middle Ages. But later scholarship showed that this particular Denis was not who he said he was. He was not a disciple of St. Paul. He was, in fact, a Syrian 5th century monk. So from this point onwards in the book, I call him Syrian Denis. And he takes us to Syria, because now I have to explain the huge backstory of Syria. And when I say Syria, I'm not talking about the modern amputated tragic state that exists today. I'm talking about historic Syria. Syria, Greater Syria, as it used to be known, which is essentially the Roman province of Syria, then the Ottoman province of Syria. It's a huge area, the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Taurus Mountains in the north right down to the Sinai Peninsula. That is Syria in its natural, historic sense. So that's when I mention Syria, that's what I'm talking about. Now, here in this picture, this particular, this is a collection that, again, very few people seem to know about. I was astonished. I assumed people knew about this collection of 2,000 churches in about 700 or 800 small communities in northern Syria. Now, this does happen to be in what is modern Syria, actually in Idlib province, the rebel-held province, where there is still fighting on a daily basis. But this is behind Antioch, historic Antioch, today's Antakya, which is now in Turkey. You see how all these countries got muddled up with their later boundaries. But the so-called dead cities they represent the most extraordinary collection of early Christian architecture on earth. I mean, it is a huge concentration. They cover the limestone hills to the south and west of Aleppo. And they are churches from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries that represent an astonishing cradle of early Christian architecture. And very belatedly, only in 2011, UNESCO recognized this area as a World Heritage Site. The war had already begun by then, and it didn't make the slightest difference. Unfortunately, there has been damage to some of these monuments. And here I'm just showing you 2 of them, 2 of the more significant churches among these dead cities in northern Syria. To the left is the church known as Kalb Lawzi, completed in 460, so we're talking mid-5th century, and this is the earliest example of the style we now talk about as Romanesque, where you have 2 towers, twin towers, flanking a monumental entrance. And the reason it was designed like that, back in the 5th century, was to receive pilgrims. Kalb Lawzi was built on the pilgrimage route to St. Simeon's Basilica, which is on the right-hand side of your picture here. St. Simeon's Basilica was the most important shrine in the whole of Christendom, and this was completed in 490. And St. Simeon preached from the top of his pillar. In the photograph there, that's the remaining stump of his pillar. It's been chipped away at over the centuries by pilgrims wanting souvenirs. But this was a hugely, hugely important site, the most important pilgrimage site in all of Christianity at that time. This is 490, late 5th century. And here is a detail of some of the astonishingly beautiful carving, because these dead cities are built from the local limestone, white limestone. And so for millennia, the local stonemasons have had an astonishing skill of stonemasonry that goes way back to the earliest history. And you can see in this example here of what's called the swaying acanthus leaves, how you even get the sense of these leaves blowing in the wind there on the top of this capital. Exquisitely beautiful, you know, it's always nature, themes of nature, with this astonishing level of skill in the stonemasonry. And incidentally, there's a capital just like that with the swaying acanthus leaves in Notre Dame itself. One pillar at the beginning of the nave has exactly that. It was almost certainly carved by a Syrian stonemason who came over to Europe later in the Middle Ages. And just again to reinforce how important St. Simeon was, here on the left is a stained glass window of St. Simeon in a tiny village in France, which is even called St. Simeon. The whole village is named after him, and there he is standing on his pillar. And on the right-hand side, you've got St. Simeon again on his pillar in a mosaic form, and this mosaic is from the inside of St. Mark's in Venice. So you have this huge early Christian reservoir, repository of architecture that was there before, that was a blend already of the earlier Hellenistic influences, all the different cultures that had existed there, all became blended and absorbed each other's, the best of each other's styles and skills, really. And so when the Umayyads, the first Islamic dynasty of Syria, and this was for a period of, you know, the conquest of Syria was around about 630, 640, up until 750. So this is, you know, 7th to 8th centuries. So of course the early Muslims inherited a lot of the architectural styles that were already there, and in fact blended it. I mean, there was no suggestion of demolishing any previous buildings. They simply absorbed what was there and slightly synthesized it into something new. And here, the Dome of the Rock was actually the first statement building, if you like, the first architectural statement by the very first Islamic dynasty, the Umayyads, in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. You know, it is, people might look at it and say, oh, but that's just a Byzantine building, look. But it's not at all. Yes, it has copied the octagonal shape, and there were early churches all across Syria with that octagonal shape and with a dome. But here, for the first time in Jerusalem, the Caliph Abdul Malik has used it differently because he's put all the decoration on the outside. Byzantine church buildings have all the decoration on the inside, and the outsides are very plain. So here, for the first time, it's a statement. As I said, it's a political statement that we are something different to the Christians. And this is important because actually in the early days of the Islamic conquest, the local populations didn't even realize that this was a new religion coming. They just thought it was another heretical sect of Christianity. So they didn't really pay much attention to start off with. And the inscription all around the outside there is a declaration to Christians, warning them not to believe in three gods. You know, this business of the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. So it is completely different. Yes, it's using the basis of the Christian architecture that was there before, but it's using it differently. And not just that, when you go inside the Dome of the Rock, there are two complete innovations. There are the pointed arches, which you can see down below. You can just see two of them there, right at the bottom where the columns, the two on the outside, have the beginnings of pointed arches. And up beneath the dome, that little arcade of tiny arches, there for the first time you see the trefoil arch, the little triple arch, which becomes such a major thing in later Gothic architecture. And I'll explain how it gets adopted. So in Damascus, which was the Umayyad capital, the first major building they built in Damascus was the Umayyad Mosque. And it's worth mentioning that for nearly 100 years, they actually shared the building that was there before. This has always been the sacred heart of Damascus. It started life as an Aramaean temple to a weather god. Then the Greeks came and turned it into a temple for Zeus, and the Romans turned it into a temple for Jupiter. The Christians turned it into the Cathedral of John the Baptist. And when the Muslims came in 743, I think it was, they shared the building. For the first 100 years of their rule, they entered through the same entrance, and the Christians turned one way and the Muslims turned the other way. And they shared that sacred space. And that arrangement only came to an end when they actually physically ran out of space. And at that point, the Muslim rulers said to the Christians, we would like now to take over this space and build our main mosque, but in exchange, we will compensate you by giving you the land for 4 new churches in the old city of Damascus. And to this day, those churches exist. They are among the 17 churches that are still inside the walls of the old city of Damascus. And on a Sunday morning, you hear church bells ringing out and blending with the call to prayer. It is a very blended society. And you only have to look at the architecture of this building to see how blended it is. So you've got the Hellenistic gable over there on the left. You've got the Byzantine-style dome. You've got the minaret, which looks like a Christian bell tower. And that is actually called the Jesus minaret, because again, in the sort of blending of the local culture, the local belief is that on the final day of judgment, Christ will descend from this tower. So it's a very blended society, and the cultures have grown up alongside each other, and this is reflected in the buildings. And here is a detail of the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, where again you can see this blending very clearly. So you have these magnificent green and gold mosaics by local Byzantine craftsmen, and they've absorbed the Trinity, the triple window idea, and the columns and the capitals of the Hellenistic sites like Palmyra that would have been all over Syria, you know, sites like Palmyra, Apamea. But the iconography is completely different. For the first time, it's showing here Islamic visions of paradise, gardens and trees and fantasized buildings. And again, the trefoil arch. Here's a detail on the left of that little trefoil arch I mentioned inside the dome of the rock. These are all elements now which the early architecture of Islam takes and synthesizes into something new, makes it its own. And the Umayyads then didn't only use these styles in religious buildings, they also, in secular buildings, they had a whole series of what are called the desert palaces, where they would go and stay. The early caliphs would go and live in sort of like rural country retreats to be away from the city. And again, here, this one, it's called Qasr al-Hayr al-Gharbi, and it's been recreated here to form the main entrance of the Damascus National Museum. And again, you can see this style of the twin towers flanking the monumental arch. So they carry that style into, which we saw in Kalblausi, they copy it and they bring it into Islamic architecture, and they use it with rounded towers here, whereas the Kalblausi was square. And here is the detail of the kind of carving that you get on these Umayyad palaces. And again, you see this astonishing level of skill of the stonemasonry, of the white limestone. And again, it's all nature and flowers and intertwining of leaves and animals. It's kind of bursting with nature and fecundity and energy. It really is a sort of a new dynasty, a new way of expressing a sort of love of nature. Another innovation that we get in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque is geometric marble window grills, and we start to see those then being carried over into Europe. On the right-hand side is one that happens to be on the side wall of the St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. St. Mark's is actually covered in marble window grills. It's got literally scores and scores of them. And another innovation from the early Umayyad palaces is what is thought by scholars to be the earliest rose window, if you like, from cathedral architecture, the way it went on to become developed. And this is from the palace of Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is in the West Bank near Jericho. And it was the subject of years and years of excavation before the creation of Israel in 1948. And the excavators found that the window was positioned high up in the audience hall, and it had stained glass, and it was designed to let in patterns of colored light. So it was an entirely decorative feature, which of course then over the centuries evolved into the absolute apogee of stained glass rose windows like Chartres Cathedral over here on the right. And here is a detail of the stained glass, which again was an accidental discovery in the researches of the book, that the actual raw materials for all this stained glass, this early 12th century stained glass in the cathedrals of Europe, was actually shipped across from Syria, because they had the perfect raw materials to make this beautiful, really thick and slightly mysterious light. Because of all the organic impurities in the plant ash, it gave it this astonishing quality, which you will never get in any modern window, because it cannot be recreated. So that is the Umayyads, the first Islamic dynasty. Then, of course, when the Umayyads came to an end in 750, rather dramatically, when the Abbasids came in and basically killed off all Umayyad, the whole Umayyad ruling family, except for one prince, Abdurrahman, who managed to escape as a young man and make his way across all of North Africa and into Spain. And there he set up the Umayyad dynasty of Cordoba as the capital now. So in Cordoba, Abdurrahman, in the late 8th century, he set about recreating his homeland, recreating Damascus. And so you can see in this aerial photograph of what today is generally known as the Cordoba Mezquita, Mezquita being Spanish for mosque. Although today, of course, it is a cathedral, it still has this sort of blended heritage, and you can see how it is modeled on Damascus in many, many ways. Here is its what was originally its minaret, which has now been adopted into the bell tower. So we have it moving in the opposite direction now, and you see how it goes up in registers, in these tiers, becoming ever narrower towards the top. And that is a feature that starts to be adopted in many Christian church towers in Europe. Inside the Cordoba Mezquita, we see for the first time on European soil astonishing command of the geometry of how to make vaulted domes. And this example, this dome is above the mihrab in one of the later extensions of the Cordoba Mezquita. So this is a 9th and 10th century extension. And only recently, some Spanish engineers got permission to go in and do a special study of this dome, and they were flabbergasted at what they found. They pronounced it at the end of their study as the most perfect example of geometry they had ever come across, and it has required no structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And it is a miracle and it shows how much more advanced the early Muslim architects were than what was on European soil at that time. I mean, we're talking 10th century. This is very, very early indeed. And right at the bottom of this picture, you can see the trefoil arches there below, just at the top of the mihrab. And at the back, if you visit the Cordoba Mezquita, on one of the back walls, they have actually displayed all the masons' marks, as they're called. So all the masons who worked on this building. And when you look at the names, they are overwhelmingly Arabic. They are Muslim names. There are just a handful of Christian names amongst them, but most of them are overwhelmingly Muslim. So it shows that these early Muslim architects, craftsmen, had an astonishing grasp of early geometry in a way that was not already there in Europe at that time. And here is a detail of the mihrab, where again you see the trefoil arch above in a very prominent position, and arches everywhere. Arches get used, and the horseshoe arch, you get the little rose arcades of arches, you get interlocking arches, arches everywhere, inside and out. And inside you then start to get the cinquefoil arches, which are 5 lobes, and multifoil arches. And the local Jewish community adopts this style as well, because here is actually a picture of the Jewish synagogue in Cordoba, and they voluntarily adopted the Islamic styles because they liked them. And so when they were actually forced out of Spain in the Christian Reconquista, and they were welcomed in Europe, parts of Europe, and by the Ottomans, they built their new synagogues using the Moorish style, as it was known at that time. And again, Medina to Zahra. This is now towards the end of Abdurrahman's dynasty, his Umayyads in Spain. This is 10th century. This is right at the very end of it. The most magnificent palace that he built, sort of like the desert palaces of Syria, much, much grander, outside Cordoba itself, to get out of the city. And delegations of European diplomats and bishops would come to these places and be astonished at there are contemporary accounts of all these things. And so now, just to give a little bit of explanation about how some of these features entered Europe as well. So on the left here, we've got the Cathedral of Amalfi on the Adriatic coast of on the coast of Italy, and around about 10th century. So this is before the Venetians became such a dominant maritime force. They were trading a lot with the Muslim ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, and so Amalfi merchants would go to places like Cairo, and there they noticed the pointed arches on the right there of the Ibn Tulun Mosque, and they liked it, and they imported the style into their cathedral, and they paid for the building of the new cathedral. And then it just so happened that a very powerful abbot from one of the Benedictine monasteries came to visit Amalfi to buy lavish gifts that had been traded, and he noticed the pointed arches and liked it very much, and said, "I would like those too in my monastery." And so this was the monastery of Monte Cassino. And so he imported the laborers, the craftsmen, and so it found its way then into the Benedictine monasteries, and then the Abbot of Cluny, which is the most powerful Benedictine powerhouse in the whole of Europe, visited Monte Cassino, saw the pointed arches, and said, "I want those too." And then you have the building of this magnificent, what's known as Cluny III, the most magnificent building with pointed arches, rows and rows of pointed arches in its nave. And once Cluny had adopted the pointed arch, that was it. It was the latest fashion, everybody wanted it. And suddenly you find that the pointed arch is used in all the pilgrimage shrines. The Benedictines sponsored the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. And so they sponsored the shrines on the cities on the pilgrimage route. And you start to see many Islamic features creeping in, which have been adopted, found their way in through the merchant ports, where people have seen the styles and liked them and said, "Oh, I like that. I'll do some of that as well." So you have this two-tone arches here. You have some Kufic inscriptions. This is the Cathedral of Le Puy in central France on the pilgrimage route to Compostela. Another way they entered was through Sicily. This is a little bit later now, in the 12th century. Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily, he again blended the architecture. So you have the famous Capella Palatina in these photos here, where you have a blend of Byzantine, Norman, and Islamic, Fatimid Egypt actually, architecture, and craftsmen were sent across from, well, a lot of them just emigrated actually. It was early immigrant labor. They just left because they were going to get better paid elsewhere, find a better future. And so they brought their skills into Sicily in the carving here of this very famous Muqarnas ceiling in the Capella Palatina on the right there. And around this time, round about the 12th and early 13th century, you start to get in Christian imagery in books and things, you start to get this image of Christ as geometer, the arch geometer of the earth. And there he is, Christ, holding the world like a globe with a pair of compasses in his hand. And it shows that finally geometry has made it into the European Middle Ages. They start to understand how important geometry is in these early constructions. And just a little quick note about the military borrowings here. This castle is in France, Chateau Gaillard, between Rouen and Paris on the River Seine, and it was built by Richard the Lionheart. After he returned from the Crusades, he noticed all the military advances of the castles he saw in the Islamic world, and that's why it's the outer keep wall here. You can see the scalloped shape of it because cannonballs, the weaponry didn't damage as much as a flat surface. So he adopted many things from the Islamic world. This is heraldry. It was another accidental discovery that the early Christian knights saw Syrian horsemen playing games on their jousting tournaments, essentially on horseback, and they had symbols on their helmets, things like fleur-de-lis. The first fleur-de-lis was actually found on the helmet of Nur ad-Din, and Christian knights liked this idea and took it back to Europe and developed it into the whole heraldic system of coats of arms, and absorbed it, and it became a very deep feature in the way that it never really was in the Muslim world. And Jerusalem now, just to go back to the Dome of the Rock, to show another example of how misinformation can be so powerful even so many centuries ago. This map dated 1486, so it's a 15th century map of Jerusalem by a local pilgrim, a Christian pilgrim who made his pilgrimage there from Germany, and he shows the Dome of the Rock as the key central monument, apparently completely misunderstanding that it is in fact a Muslim shrine. And this goes back to a Crusader mistake where the Crusaders, the Templar Knights, thought that the Dome of the Rock was the palace, the Temple of Solomon. And so they turn it into a sort of Christian shrine, believing, completely mistaking what it is. And as a result, many Christian buildings across Europe are actually then copying this earliest Muslim shrine. Now, Venice is an incredibly Islamic city. There's a whole chapter in the book explaining these sort of gateways to Europe. Venice is one of the major ones. Again, early scholars have done a lot of work on this, and I build on their work. Basically, I freely, talk about people like Deborah Howard, who was the professor of architectural history at Cambridge University. She spent 10 years of her life researching the Islamic influence on the architecture of Venice, and it's she's written beautifully about it. So I draw heavily on her work there. And in Venice, here we have an example of borrowings in that Palazzo Dario on the left. You see what's called the telephone dial motif, that circular motif. That is borrowed straight off Mamluk buildings in Cairo. And to the right there is the Doge's palace, very sort of delicate filigree, and again, very, very copied then throughout. Many buildings across Europe are copying the Doge's palace. one of the strangest of the lot is actually a revival building. This is a 19th century carpet factory in Glasgow, which is modelled on the Doge's Palace, a sort of cathedral to commerce, if you like. And again, now on the revivals, so on the left there, we've got Burgos Cathedral, which goes back to one of the earliest cathedrals in the 13th century in Spain. And on the right, you have the Sagrada Familia, the ultimate Gothic building, if you like, built by Antoni Gaudi, the Spanish architect, where you can really see this business of the fusion of nature that I think is so strong in Gothic architecture and in early Umayyad architecture, this profusion of intertwining and huge detail. And the Sagrada Familia is just a sort of magnificent combination of religion and geometry and nature. And it has a real organic quality to it. And here is a detail of the facade, which again reminds me so strongly of some of those early Umayyad facades with nature just bursting out from the stone. And these final pictures now of some more of the revivals. So in London, we have Big Ben going up in registers all the way to the top and becoming more and more elaborate towards the top, like those early minarets. And the detail here of the Houses of Parliament, it's covered in trefoil arches and pointed arches, like all Gothic architecture. The Gothic revival of the 19th century is covered in it. And of course, even in America, this all carried over to America. So I'm just going to end with a couple of rather surprising pictures of, this is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., where Joe Biden prayed before becoming in his inauguration as president of the States. And you can see arch in the middle, you've got pointed arches, trefoil arches, you've got all the elements of Gothic and the rose window there that we've been talking about as originating far, far further east. You've got the Yale campus. Yale University is stuffed full of Gothic. It's described as a Gothic campus. On the left there, you've got the Harkness Tower. On the right, you've got one of the main libraries, which looks for all the world like a Gothic nave. And then finally, so Gothic architecture in the States is incredibly popular in universities and colleges. Nowhere in the world has more Gothic in its academia than America. And Yale University is an almost entirely Gothic campus. On the left there, you have the Harkness Tower. And on the right, you have one of the main lending libraries, which looks for all the world like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And the final slide now of the US Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. And of course, here we almost are going back to St. Paul's Cathedral in a way. So he is using here, the architecture is using the Islamic double dome. And this is what Christopher Wren says at the beginning. He describes how he uses of St. Cathedral, he uses the Saracen vaulting technique because it is the best, he says. And this involves a double dome, and the US Capitol Dome is the same structure. It's a double dome where the exterior profile is different to the interior profile, and you have a hollow space in between. And so that is really the end of the talk. Really, it's all about how everything blends together. One of the things I'm most proud of, actually, in this book is the endorsement it received from Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said how for him, the book illustrates how our cultures interact and interweave in ways that challenge all kinds of assumptions we might make about our history. And that's the key. We're challenging assumptions about this history. And in his view, he says this poses essential questions about the possibility of a shared and humane civilization in the future. And that was really my purpose in writing the book, to show how dependent we all are on each other, how we're all interwoven in ways we don't necessarily understand. And sometimes these things just have to be pointed out. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed hearing that. And I will now.
Dan, that was Thank you, Dan. That was a wonderful tour of sort of Islamic architecture from its emergence in the early 7th century through to the Umayyad and its transformation as it reached Spain and, of course, southern Italy in the 9th century. Of course, a lot of these lands were under Islamic rule. I mean, Italy, we know, was Sicily was under Muslim rule until from the 9th to the 11th century when the Normans conquered it. And one forgets the breadth of the domination of early Islamic world and how it remained an important generator of both technology, science, and ideas and aesthetics. I'm fascinated by this concept which you put forward, which of course everybody subliminally knows, but that you've articulated, is this developing of ideas which are based on different traditions. It's very pertinent for Pakistan and in India and Bangladesh, where throughout Muslim rule, the non-Muslim population dominated the land. So definition, the two cultures were much more immersed and intertwined than we give them credit for. I mean, present situation not included, but it is fascinating. And the sooner we understand that we are a mixture of two traditions, that we are bicultural, as it were, the better a society we make. But I want to ask you more about 17th century Britain. And this, as Julian Raby says, was the period of the three superpowers of the time, which are the Mughals, Safavids, and Ottomans. And of course, Europe was looking and buying books and trying to educate itself from information that came from the East. The Bodleian, as you rightly say, was buying books and storing them. Would you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. It's obviously a very relevant coincidence that Christopher Wren, who was educated at Oxford University, the time he spent there as a student coincided with this this sort of blossoming of the study of Arabic. So the first chair of Arabic was set up by Archbishop Laud in Oxford, and to this day, I mean, when I studied Arabic at Oxford, my professor was the Laudian professor of Arabic. So that chair that was established back in the 17th century still exists, but it was the very first time that there were proper Arabic scholars working in universities like Oxford and Cambridge. And Christopher Wren, being the sort of man he was, very open-minded and wanting to learn from as many sources as possible. And of course, he was a mathematician. His understanding of geometry was astonishing. I mean, he was so advanced in all these. He designed things that were completely new, ceilings that would hold themselves up by clever use of geometry. The Sheldonian Theatre is one I talk about in the book. It's a very early commissions he had. So he believes in taking the best from wherever he finds it, and so he wasn't remotely concerned about a vaulting method that happened to have been developed in the Islamic world. If it was the best, it's what he was going to use. And when he himself didn't travel much. I mean, he actually, the only time he left this country, Britain, was to go to France, to Paris, for 6 months to escape the plague. Rather relevantly, his health wasn't the greatest, and so he went to Paris so that he would hopefully survive the plague as a young man, and then came back. But he read hugely all the travel literature of the time, and there was the start of a lot of people traveling to Istanbul, and travel literature. And he always asked people who returned to show him pictures, to draw him down. He would ask them questions. How did they get the lead to stay on their domes? He wanted to know all these other methods. He was eager to learn. where he could improve techniques always.
But the whole interest in Arabic and Persian, because of course Bodleian's has one of the best collections of Persian books, of early Persian and Arabic books, but was the interest because Europe was interested in those areas? I mean, were they learning the language because of their interest in trade? Were they learning it because they wanted to travel to this? I mean, there was obviously something in those lands which attracted all these scholars.
Yes, I think it was the luck of timing that everything came together. We had the right people in the right positions of power who had the ability to commission merchants to go and collect these manuscripts. So people like Archbishop Laud persuaded other important, influential people to insist that every ship that set sail to the Eastern Mediterranean made a point of coming home with at least one Arabic manuscript. So people were sent into the souks to go and seek out more knowledge and bring it back to study. So it's having the right people in the right place at the right time, and open-minded people who were there. And sometimes, of course, these people who spent several years living in Arab countries were often chaplains to merchants. So you had small merchant communities, for instance, in places like Aleppo and Damascus, and a chaplain would be sort of sent to them on postings for, say, 5 years. And so over that period, they would gradually become quite skilled in their own translation of these Arabic manuscripts. And some of those people became then the top scholars of their time. So yes, people like Pocock and...
Yes.
You know,
but yeah, I mean, it just sort of illustrates the importance of having information, because of course that wealth of information did not just benefit the 17th century, but even today, we can make use of it. That, you know, your ability to be able to do a scholarly.
You've got to be open to it, though. That's the thing. You've got to be open to this information.
Yes, I think that's the key. I think that's absolutely the lesson one learns from your book, is that we all have to accept that we are not islands, that we are part of a larger community, and that we take from other communities.
Yes,
and across religious, divides as well, which.
Well, that's right. So that takes us actually quite neatly right back to the beginning and Notre Dame. So it was the fact that it was being claimed as a symbol of French identity, European, the sort of, the glory of Europe, the Gothic cathedrals. And it annoyed me, because I just thought, how ridiculous that these people actually think that everything to do with Notre Dame was, originated in France, and have claimed it, if you like, claimed it for themselves. And that's what made me write the book, actually, as a kind of, setting the record straight, to sort of say, look, you have to accept some of this stuff, because the architecture is there as the proof. You can't argue with it. It's not a theory. The building is there. You can see all the elements for yourself.
That's a wonderful note to end on, and we should continue this conversation and look at some of the Islamic and Hindu architecture that comes out of India and Pakistan, because that does it even to this day. So it is fascinating and very pertinent. Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you.